Hello there, my name is Sarah Juhnke, and I chose the Cornfield Navy LST for my PowerPoint presentation. Welcome to History 216, and thank you for watching my PowerPoint. I chose LST in the Cornfield Navy because I know that the LST 393 is in our backyard of Muskegon, Michigan. Growing up, I was able to dance. All of my recitals took place on the 393. And I was immediately drawn to it when I saw that it was an option for the PowerPoint. So thank you for coming along with me, and let's start our journey. So what is an LST? Well, you see, an LST is the largest beaching type landing ship. It's a cargo ship, a combat ship, all in one. Where a combat ship is mostly just used for hauling troops and hauling weapons, and they were ready to defend their ship at any time. And a cargo ship carried lots of weapons, and it carried a lot of military equipment. The cool thing about an LST is it really used both a cargo ship and a combat ship and made one type of ship. The deck space was much larger than a cargo ship, and it was much larger than a combat ship. The LST also had a really cool feature where you could open the bow of the ship. It has huge doors that would allow the tanks to come in and come out easily. The LST also was able to be loaded and unloaded very easily. The LST was called the most versatile ship in World War II. This is a very big deal. So let's get into the need of the LST. Well, the need of the LST really was to be able to unload without the use of any docking equipment. Like I mentioned earlier, the LST had these huge doors, and that allowed for equipment, troops to be loaded and unloaded very fast and very easily. The other thing that was cool about the LST is that it could attack, pull right up to the shoreline of enemies and attack from right there. So that was very useful and very unique to any of the other type of ships during World War II. The LST was very spacious, so it could carry large amount of supplies, equipment, and then not needing that docking equipment just made it a really neat ship. The other thing that really was helpful during World War II is that they realized very quickly that we needed to be able to be mobilized. We needed to be able to get to enemy shores with a lot of stuff. We needed to be able to pull up to enemy shores with our troops, with our prisoners on board, with our weapons ready to go. And the LST really was able to facilitate all of these needs. The LST in its ship size. So I put on here that the LST ranged in size. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is after diving in deep to the LST, I discovered that every LST was not made necessarily the same. Ideally, they would have been made the same, but when you have men who have never welded, never worked on any type of machinery like this, and you put them together and you say, we need to pump out ships and we need to do so fast, there is going to be some discrepancy on ship size, welds, and how these are being built. However, they were roughly 3,600 tons, which is a huge vessel. They were roughly 390 feet long and 50 feet wide. So again, when I talk about all of the equipment, all of the people, all of the troops that were on these ships, it's because they are gigantic. The first LST that was ever made was the LST 157. The launching of this ship took place on October 31st, 1942. This ship was also named Hull 1. However, moving forward, the shipyards stopped publicly naming the ships by numbers, as they did not want the enemy to know how many of these ships were produced. Each ship was sponsored. The first ship, the 157, was sponsored by Mrs. DeWitt de Grave. The crowd sung the national anthem during this launching. All right, so what is on the LST? Well, there's a number of different things that are going to be found on an LST. I want to stop and talk about this picture though and discuss these doors that you see in the photo. This is what I was talking about. This is what's so cool about the LST is these large doors that open up. So all of these military vehicles that you see, they're actually going to drive right onto the ship. And so I think that this is a really neat picture and it really demonstrates these military vehicles being able to just drive, park on the right into the ship. You just did not see that on any other ship in World War II. So what is on the LST? Well, at any given time, there's going to be roughly 60 tanks. There's going to be vehicles like we see in the picture, equipment, supplies, materials, and troops. Now, when these boats were going to enemy shores, it was very common that they would take back with them about 5,000 prisoners. So that was kind of a cool feature too, is because the ship was so large that they could store in a different area about 5,000 prisoners. So they would take those prisoners back with them. The LST was given many nicknames, some nice and some not so nice. Some of these nicknames included the large ship tank, the landing ship tank, when beached the Green Dragon, the man-made whale, large slow target, long slow target, large stationary target, green tropical dragon. Once the ship was built, they were commission inspected very thoroughly. Each ship would be inspected by both civilian inspectors and naval inspectors. Every weld, electrical connection, hydraulic fitting was scrutinized. The shipyard struggled with welding, so they made a welding school that they offered to the men that they could train at for free. Each ship was taken to the Ohio River for a test run. The shipbuilders would often watch their ships be placed into the river. In the offices in the shipyard, there were boards documenting how long it took each ship to be built. This is another picture that I just love of two LSTs. You'll notice that they are pulled right up onto the enemy shoreline. They're at water that the men, it's not too deep. They're about waist deep. They're loading stuff onto the ship. Some of them are taking a break. You'll notice here too that the men, for the most part, are just rail thin, just very thin, working really hard. But it is really cool to see that they are able to load in the water and how this ship just came right onto the shoreline. Earlier, I went into saying that about 60 tanks would fit on an LST. Here we get to see all of these tanks in line waiting to get onto the LST. Again, they just open up those large doors. You can see how close these LSTs are to the shoreline at the beach, which I think again is just such a cool feature of the LST. And so these tanks are waiting to be loaded into the LST to go fight the enemies. Years of service. So the LST ran from about 1942, like I had mentioned earlier. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, we decided very quickly that we needed to mobilize and we needed to mobilize fast. That was why they were able to put so many LSTs together. And the LST actually saw service up until 2002, which is a really cool thing about this ship. And we still have a few LSTs hanging around. The LST typically carried 193 troops. Of the troops, there were a 169-man crew, 9 officers, 120 men normally working on the ship at all times. The officers were from the Navy Reserves. You might be wondering, what were the downsides to the LST? The LST was very slow moving. It was hard to disguise, and it typically needed a 1 to 2 day head start. Retracting the ship was very complex. The boat was also incredibly rocky for anyone on board of it. The large ship also was typically stranded during low tides. You might be wondering what was so special about the LST. The LST was so special because it was the most versatile ship of World War II. It did not require docking equipment nor cranes to unload the equipment. It delivered soldiers to hostile shores and was very spacious. Beaching the LST and factors that had to be considered. When beaching the ship, it had to be less than full capacity. Beaching needed to happen as close to the water's edge as possible. Some factors that needed to be considered were the angles of the waves, wind speed and direction, coral heads, and large rocks. With water being so unpredictable, this was very challenging. Retracting the ship was very complicated. On occasion, it had to be stranded due to the low tide. You were always working against the wind and the current. Now that we have discussed what an LST is, let's talk about the Cornfield Navy and the Cornfield Shipyard. Walter Couch of International Steel was given credit for the shipyard in Evansville. He secured the military contract, although this was not an easy task. He picked Evansville due to its proximity to the Ohio River. So the background of the word cornfield. So that's kind of interesting, being from Michigan, living in the Midwest, living on a farm, and knowing all about cornfields. So because these shipyards were constructed in the Midwest, they were given the nickname cornfield shipyards. Now, were the ships actually built in the middle of the cornfield? No, not necessarily. However, they were built in Midwest cities and states, and so that gave them that nickname. The nickname stuck, and so that is why they are the LST and the Cornfield Navy. So the Cornfield Navy just meant that these men who were constructing the ships were all from the cornfields. Evansville, Indiana was one of the biggest homes to the LST. The boats were built and would be test run in the Ohio River. This helped their economy and supplied jobs. Other cities that had LSTs being built there were Jeffersonville, Seneca, and some states like Illinois and Indiana. Evansville produced ships at a rapid speed. Out of 1,051 ships built, 171 were produced at Evansville, Indiana. The employment of the Cornfield Navy. Evansville, Indiana employed over 19,000 workers. They were always looking to hire more people, and they published this weekly in their newspaper. No naval experience was needed. They paid good wages, and they supplied apartments to those who were in need, as people from as far away as Kentucky came to Evansville to work in this shipyard. Who did they employ? Mostly men and women who could not serve in the war. Job candidates for the Cornfield Navy. Evansville hired men and women, both black and white. The normal work week was 6 days on with 1 day off. The pay was $1.20 an hour. Each LST launching was a celebration. When launching these ships, they would typically have a champagne toast. Lucy Sorensen Pape, she launched the LST 393 in 1942. As an incentive, an employee of the month was able to sponsor the ship. He could pick from his wife's name, his mother's name, sister or daughter's name. Launchings were invite only. No cameras were allowed at these launchings as they were concerned that information could be leaked to the enemy. The Invader. The Cornfield Navy had its own newspaper. It was published once a month. It contained information about the latest launchings, news from the war front, and news about the various sports teams that happened at the shipyard. Loose lips sink ship. The Invader also published safety guidelines for the ships. The phrase loose lips sink ships was coined during this time. It was regularly published as a reminder that men and women who worked in these shipyards could not share what they were working on. Again, they were very concerned that information would be leaked to the enemy. The shipyards began to grow to be a city within a city. They had hospitals, cafeterias, security force, and even a newspaper. The men typically worked on the ships, while the women typically worked in the hospital and the cafeterias. Security was a prime concern during World War II. The shipyards had their own security force. Entry to the shipyard was employees only. Each employee had an ID badge, and they were only allowed in their working area. They were worried about spies and worried about sabotage. Evansville did catch fire a few times. However, it was never proven that this was any type of sabotage. Here in this photo, we see the crew gathered. I just can't help but look at this photo and see all these young men's faces and just think that they have no idea what they've signed up for and wonder how many of them came back. I do notice all the way to the right-hand side, I kind of wonder if that gentleman that's standing up is one of the naval officers. It's just a really cool picture of all the men on the LST, and you get to kind of see how large the platform really is. In this photo, we get to see the cargo being loaded onto the LST ship. It took days for them to prepare and to load these ships. You could imagine how much work that would be, just preparing all the supplies, preparing the tanks, preparing the troops to get on board of these ships. We have to remember that what they're going to is enemy land. They're going there to fight. I just think of all the anxiety the men must have had knowing where they were going. In this photo, you will see large tanks waiting to be loaded onto the LST. The caption of the picture reads that this was 2 days prior to the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Here we get to see the LST in all of its glory. This is a great picture where you get to see that the LST had very large doors. This made it easy for the men to load and unload items onto the ships. In this photo, we get to see planes departing from the LST and men watching. So I thought that this was really cool. I found a little bit of research saying that sometimes they would have small planes on board the ship. And that was in case there was an emergency, they needed to fly fast to get out of there. So I thought that this was a really cool picture just to kind of show the small plane leaving the LST. In this photo, we get to see the crew unloading railroad cars. You can see that they made a platform that comes right off of the ship. So this would be at a docking site, and they would be loading the LST. They would have all of the equipment prepared, and they would be prepared to leave. I mentioned earlier in my slide that the LST would actually need to take off 2 to 3 days prior than the other troops. And this was because the ship was very slow moving. So it carried a lot, great in a lot of ways, but such a slow moving ship that they had to get a head start. Again, it could take days or weeks to even load the ship. So this was a bit of a process, but that LST really did just hold so much that it did make it a versatile ship. Japan's surrender of 1945. The shipyards were born with the war and they died with the war. The demand for the ships after the surrender were little to none. Evansville caught fire in 1946. This damaged most of its building. Today, there is a museum on the property. Present day LSTs. We are very fortunate because we have an LST right in our backyard. The LST 393. In 1950, the LST 393 was used to haul cars from Michigan to Milwaukee. There are only 2 LSTs left in the United States. Most of the LSTs were scrapped for metal. The LST 393 is open for tours. This is the LST 393. This is the LST that is located in Muskegon, Michigan. So we still have it in our very own backyard. Only 2 are left. And one of them, like I said, is right here in our backyard. So I would really encourage everyone to tour the LST 393. There is a museum, and it is downtown, located at 560 Mart Street, Muskegon, Michigan. At the museum, you get to see wartime records, you get to tour the ship, and you get to see pictures. There's even LST gear. And in the summer, on Friday nights, they do movies on their deck, which is a really cool event. So I would greatly encourage all of you to check out the LST 393. My name is Sarah Juhnke. Thank you so much for watching my PowerPoint presentation on the LST and the Cornfield Navy. This is for History 216. Thank you so much again.